Hey. All right, we're getting started back, and I misspoke. It's my turn again. This is the last sort of set of presentations from me today, but I am going to go ahead and share my screen again. And what I want to talk with you about now, this time, I can make it work. There we go. So we talked a lot about the past and a lot about ideas and concepts and not a lot of specifics. And so in this section, I really want to give you some action steps that can be taken and applied in any kind of organization. So the idea here is that it's built for if you're a student and you work at Cal Poly or another institution, and maybe you work here in Cal Poly with one of the enterprises, you can take these ideas and apply them and use them, because these are based on the research and the writings of those experts that I showed you earlier today. So, specific action steps, I want to first remind you about some of the key pieces. We are concerned here when we're talking about crisis communication, we are concerned about the perceptions, right? This is what triggers us to be extra attentive, okay? It's not that that's the only time we care or that we're interested. It's what triggers this crisis communication process. And then again, this idea that we're really talking about you need to be a good actor. We are asserting that an organization and its individuals needs to have good intentions. And without that, before a crisis, it's really difficult or next to impossible to recover as an organization, okay? Another new slide here is lessons on communicating effectively during crisis. And this is listed in, I believe it's the Ulmer, Selnow, and Seeger book. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are a few that are really important. So in terms of doing work before a crisis hits, you need to make sure that your organization has strong partnerships with individuals and groups, so your stakeholders. You also need to acknowledge, that you need to also make sure that you address primary and secondary stakeholders and that you have strong positive relationships with them. We'll talk in just a couple of minutes about what's primary and what's secondary and how do you know. And then making sure that you understand that effective work in crisis communication is really about listening to stakeholders. So again, there's, all of these are important, but in terms of what we're going to talk about here, I really want to emphasize the role of stakeholders. So 2 specific things that can make a world of difference in terms of preparing for crisis situations. The first one is building relationships, strong relationships with stakeholders. And the second one is really a two-parter. It's assembling a crisis management team within your organization and creating a crisis communication plan. So I'm going to talk about each one of these and give you some specifics. So am I talking about stakeholders like these? No. And if you know, so there are a couple of folks on the webinar today who know me, and I tend to start all of my classes with memes, and memes that are related to our topics. And so I couldn't resist a little bit of meme humor today. But am I talking about these kinds of stakeholders? No. I am talking about stakeholders are these either individuals or groups who have any interest, right, claim, or ownership in an organization. And as we saw with the definition of crisis, there are tons of different definitions of stakeholders. There are some commonalities that are important to know about. And for me and for us today, I think one of the most important things is this idea of groups or individuals who have an interest in your organization. You could argue that having a claim or having some ownership is really what makes a stakeholder. But when we're talking about planning for crisis and planning for communication and addressing and doing the right thing, to me, one of the right things is to make sure that you are aware of any individuals and groups who are interested in your organization, and interest needs to be expressed, right? It can't just be in their head. How do you know? But there are ways, tons of ways. Easiest one that comes to mind is digital and social media. And what are people saying about you or your organization on those platforms? So stakeholders are anybody who has an interest. Then we take this idea of primary stakeholders and secondary stakeholders. And a great way to sort of suss out who is who here, primary stakeholders are those people who have the ability to harm or benefit your organization through their actions. Okay, so this is a matter of action. Can they do things, and that involves doing and saying things that are beneficial to your organization or harmful. Those are people or groups that you would consider primary stakeholders. And when we get to this idea of secondary stakeholders, these are individuals or groups, again, who can affect or be affected by the actions of your organization. And so, as I tell my students a lot, it's not a clear line, right? It's not black and white. So you really need to be, making serious effort to know who these groups are and what their level of influence is. And are their actions going to hurt you or help you? You really need to be working with them, learning about them, those types of things to sort of suss out who they are. And so this is one of my favorite diagrams from the perspective that it really illustrates many different potential stakeholder groups. There are tons of different diagrams that you could find that are useful for this, and that are good and include all kinds of groups. But I particularly like this one because it categorizes, right? It says not just employees, but it talks about retired employees, new employees, people who are considered labor, people who are considered management. A lot of times there's tension among groups of employees. And so understanding that you can look at employees as a stakeholder group, but then you need to make sure that you understand there may be subgroups in this stakeholder group. And so again, the reason that I like this diagram is that it really does pull out some of those differences. Another one here that comes to mind is, and that I really like and appreciate the diagram for, is this idea of multicultural community groups. So not only community groups, but multicultural community groups. And this is something that triggers some of my own professional background. I once worked for a meatpacking company. It was a multinational company, and it was headquartered in Colorado. And before I started working for them, the company actually had a meatpacking plant in town, and then the corporate headquarters were in the same place. And the company was, for a business reason, decided that they didn't want to have two shifts of meat processing in a day. So they used to have a morning shift and an evening shift. And so they decided, for business reasons, whether that was good or bad, who knows, to say we're gonna lay off the second shift. That was a big, big, big story and a big potential crisis for the organization. And what the organization did was they knew that this was going to impact their stakeholders, not only their employees, but because the town was fairly small and the company was a big employer in the town, they knew well their stakeholder groups, and they knew what multicultural community groups, civic groups like the United Way, religious groups, the local parishes, all those types of things, and local businesses. They worked with these different groups. And I think it's an excellent illustration of the fact that the company, even though it was doing this thing and it actually did it, it didn't listen to criticism, it needed to make this business decision. But the fact that they were so aware of the impact that this business move was going to have on the community, and that there were strong stakeholder relationships with community groups, is really a small success story in avoiding a crisis situation for the organization. Unfortunately, it didn't help, of course, the people who were laid off, but in terms of an organization and the organization's reputation, it really was a positive thing. And it did actually also help those affected in terms of getting connected to new jobs. There was some job training, getting resources, food help, things like that. So so again, I really like this diagram because not only does it qualify media and governments, it really does break out and give you an idea of who are some of the stakeholder groups. So it's nice to think, okay, people who have an interest in our organization, but what are some examples of stakeholders? And so that's why I show this diagram about stakeholder groups. Another thing to know about crisis communication or communication during a crisis that's really, really important is understanding that these different audiences, these different stakeholder groups are going to have different information needs, especially during a crisis. Typically, they probably have maybe some similar needs in terms of information related to your organization, but particularly during a crisis, it's really important that they have information that is tailored to their particular concern or area of interest in relation to your organization. So in thinking about stakeholder relationships, the research and the literature really tells us that without this, we can actually have very awkward or ineffective communication during a crisis. So if you don't have these relationships, starting to communicate with people in a crisis can not only be awkward, but ineffective. And I would even argue it could be a potential backlash for you. It reminds me a little bit of, you have an old professor who you loved and had a good relationship with when you were a student. And then, 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line, you are interested in maybe going to graduate school. And you call that professor up or email that professor and say, hey, I'm interested in going to graduate school. Would you write me a letter of recommendation? It's awkward, right? If you don't keep up a relationship with that person, if you only get in touch with them when you need something, it's awkward. And so the solution to this is establishing what's called two-way communication. And in public relations, again, what we mean by this is strategic communication on behalf of an organization. And Gruening is one of the fundamental or foundational researchers in public relations, and he established, or he sort of categorized and did research on, there are 4 models of public relations. And really this diagram is not so important other than to know this bottom model, the what's called two-way symmetrical model of communication in public relations is really, really important. And the reason for that is it uses two-way communication. So it's not just the organization doing what's number one, the press agentry or publicity model, where you're just pushing out information, and historically, it's been about persuasion and manipulation. What we talk about when we talk about public relations classes, a great example of this is some of the propaganda during World War II. Also, Barnum and Bailey. Barnum was a real propagandist and really pushed out information, didn't listen to what the consumers wanted, and really put out his messages to try and influence and persuade people. The public information model, the second one, the idea here is that you're taking a little bit more of an honest step towards communicating, but you're putting out information and making it informational, focusing on information, not necessarily focusing on helping people interpret that information or how they can use that information, but it really is pushing out information. And then this third one is, again, using influence to try and get people to to behave the way that the organization wants them. And so all of these you can see are one way, information being pushed out for different ways and in different purposes. The two-way model is not only putting out information, but really it actually starts with this idea of listening to stakeholders, making sure that you are familiar with your publics. What conflicts do they have with respect to your organization? What things do they need to understand from you, and what do you need to understand from them? And so this is this idea of mutual understanding and respect. So sharing information and listening and going back and forth. And one of the things that the public relations field really talks about is digital and social media has made two-way communication so easy for organizations, right? It's easy to hear what people think about our company these days, because if they don't like us, they'll be on social media about it. And hopefully if they really like us, they'll be on social media about it as well. So we have a much easier time of listening. The problem is a lot of organizations don't do this. They try, or they say they're going to, but they don't actually practice it. So it's important to be aware that a true two-way communication and listening and interacting with your stakeholders is what's going to help you build a positive stakeholder relationship. And so, although we've identified groups of stakeholders, how do we start identifying who are our organization's stakeholders? How do we go about finding out who these people are? Well, the first step is to step back and say, okay, for our organization, we're going to do what's called an inventory, a crisis inventory. And here, over here on the right, is a not very great photo, so I apologize, of a crisis inventory. And basically what you do here, and this is from Kathleen Fern Banks, who is again one of those authors, you think about the potential crisis that your organization can face, all right? And just as an example that comes to mind first, think about the probability of a multinational or a global pandemic, right? What's the probability that that is going to happen? And say we're the organization, say Cal Poly is the organization. And so as you're planning at Cal Poly, you're planning for what's the probability of this? Well, depends on what kind of information you have, right? If you're listening to the science and you're listening to some of the research that's been published, you would probably have an indication that a global pandemic was not out of the realm of possibility. And so if you were preparing a crisis plan for Cal Poly and you were saying, well, here's a potential crisis, you would rank that probability of that particular crisis happening. And I would say you could probably say it was a 3 or maybe even a 4, depending on how much information you have and what you know about this potential crisis. So you would do a rank on the probability. And then the second ranking that you do is for each of those possible crises, you rank it in terms of what the damage to your organization would be. So probably for Cal Poly, a global pandemic wouldn't be a 5. Yes, it might be damaging. Yes, it might be front page news, but it wouldn't necessarily drive Cal Poly to not be in existence anymore. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So Cal Poly as a state university, as part of the California State University system, as a public education institution, isn't really a great example because the idea of a university that is part of a public system going out of business, so to speak, is really pretty unheard of. However, it could be a major media issue. It could cause considerable damage to the university. Maybe the damage isn't in that there's a ton of students getting sick, but maybe the damage is to the university's endowments, right? And the economics of what's happening in the country. And the crisis could be that the university doesn't have money because we rely on, you know, things that are invested and dividends from investment for certain things. And so there could be less money. So that would be considerable damage to the institution or to the organization. So the idea here is that you take both the probability and the damage, and you create yourself a graph. And really, this seems like a very basic thing. And like, why would I need to do that? I can just see the numbers. Well, for folks that are pretty visual like me, this really shows me, what do I need to pay attention to? Out of these 5 potential crises, workplace violence has a 5 in terms of it could really damage our organization. And the probability of it happening is pretty high. So we're probably going to want to create some sort of plan about addressing workplace violence as a crisis. A lot of this is working in a way that we don't want to think about this. We don't want this to happen. And so we probably feel like we want to shy away from it. But this data indicates this is something we should plan for. Okay, and so you can kind of look at the other potential crises on this inventory and make decisions. And the argument is the potential crises that rank high here are the ones that you should plan for. So in terms of planning and preparing, there's 2 things: the building the crisis management team and then creating the plan itself. So I'm going to quickly go through these. When you are building a team within your organization, that is your crisis management team, you need to look for 3 things. 1, people in functional roles, and I'll talk about what those are in just a minute. 2, people who have quote unquote hard skills or content area expertise. And 3, you need to think about people's quote unquote soft skills, employability skills, sometimes we call these, interpersonal skills. Some of the literature talks about social and emotional effectiveness constructs. So these are skills and characteristics. We'll talk about those in just a minute. So in terms of functional roles, people you're looking for to put on your team, you are almost always interested in having somebody from each different department in your organization, however large or small. But then depending on the crisis you're planning for, you might want to have a particular person or multiple people from some of these functional areas. And so a great example of this is, all right, you're a small food processing company, and security, data security probably isn't number 1 on your threat list. However, if you're gathering data about sensitive data, and you're gathering a lot of data and you share data, you might be planning for a data-related crisis. And so you might think about, okay, we definitely need to make sure that we have people from IT, right? But because of the nature of this, we might want 2 people with IT expertise. And so these functional roles, for the most part, they're people within your organization. But if you're really small, you might have somebody outside your organization who's sort of an ally or who has a partnership with you, who could be an expert in this functional role for your planning. Second one is this idea of quote unquote hard skills or content knowledge. And typically these are things that you have some sort of degree or certification in. Great one that comes to mind right away on this is somebody who has the ability to code a website or manage data, things like that. Something as simple as typing speed. I know that we don't think a whole lot about this anymore, but somebody who has a high typing speed, that is content knowledge, that is a hard skill. And so you want to look for people who have expertise in the areas that your inventory indicates. Okay. And again, you can look to, especially if you're a smaller organization, if there's somebody outside your organization that is trustworthy or that you're allied with, somebody from an industry group or a partner organization, those folks could be on your crisis management team. Okay. So thinking about what are another one that comes to mind when I think about this hard skills or content knowledge, working in the beef industry and working for a meat processor, one of the people who I was in constant, contact and communication with was the person who was head of quality assurance. at the company, because not only was he in charge of quality assurance, but then he was connected, and that was his area of expertise. But in his area of expertise, there was a need for him to connect with the labor force and problems with the labor force and making sure that people were not injured and things like that. So his hard skill or his content knowledge area was quality assurance, and we wanted him on our team when we were planning for crises. So these are what's called social and emotional effectiveness constructs. Sometimes people call them soft skills. They are harder to quantify. They are not tangible, but they're just as important. The first one here is political skill. And political skill is actually, I know it sounds like a very negative thing, but researchers and really, I think this is really helpful, especially for things like this that are very intangible. Political skill has been broken down into these four sort of concept areas or construct areas. This idea that somebody is able to observe social interactions among people and correctly interpret how people are behaving, okay? Then there's this idea of influence. People can influence others and get desired results. I want to remind you that what we're talking about here is good, honest brokers. We're not talking about manipulation. We're not talking about cheating or dishonesty, those types of things, but people who are able to influence others. We want someone who has network ability. They can find and meet and talk with people in different groups, diverse groups, identifying who those people are, and then making those contacts, right? And then this last component is not only, in my book, not only being honest, but appearing honest and authentic, and not coming across as if you have ulterior motives. So these four items go into this first one of political skill, but things here as well: communication skill, how adaptable and flexible are people? Do they have the ability to motivate others? Are they patient? There are certain qualities of these soft skills, these social emotional effectiveness constructs, that you want to be aware of and be thinking about when you're picking people for your team. If you have someone who is not good at working with others and is not patient, but has a functional role or has really important content knowledge, you need to make a decision. Is this fact that they have that they don't have good soft skills in this other area, what does that look like? Well, that's an individual decision for you and your organization. But these are some things to really be thinking about, because it can really advance or help your cause if you're looking at people who have these skills. And so once you've looked at your crisis management team and you've sort of put that together, then you want to take the step to draft your crisis communication plan. And here you want to start at the beginning. And it seems a little bit silly. This is one of the things to think about and keep in mind with crisis communication planning is documentation, documentation, documentation. It's a lot of writing things down and putting it in the plan. The first thing that's really important to do, even though it seems like it might not be, is an acknowledgement of the plan and its importance and its role at the organization, acknowledging that the work that goes into this process is important. It helps people with buy-in. Next, you want to make sure, a lot of times crisis communication plans have confidential information or proprietary information. So you want to make sure that there's a statement at the front and that you have each member of the management team, the crisis management team, sign it. Again, that gets buy-in from people to not share this information outside of the organization. You want to include and actually do some rehearsals. You want to do some rehearsals or simulations using this plan. And then in the last sort of beginning section here, you want to make sure that you include that crisis inventory that you've done. So maybe your top 5 potential crises and their impact for your organization. And you also want to talk about what's the purpose of the plan? What are the goals and objectives that go along with this plan? How are we going to look at this strategically? How does this go into our overall organization and help us move forward as an organization? So, as I said, documentation. Several things here, and you can see this list. I'm going to just talk briefly about each one of these. The list of who's on the team and contact information sounds like a duh, but some of the, I would say the fundamental value of the documentation here is it's all in one place, right? You are in a crisis situation. You do not have to go running for this information. Here it is. challenging to keep it up to date? Yes. Stakeholder groups, who are the individuals, their contact information. You want to make sure you have things like incident report forms, and that can be something that your organization creates, but it gets at the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the incident itself. You want to have a team management strategy, a plan for who you're going to talk to, the goal of those communications, specifically what are you going to do, how are you going to share that information, and then copies of what are the messages that go along with a potential E. coli outbreak at your processing facility. What are the points that you need to make sure to get across? Then there's this idea of the stakeholder contact worksheet, and the documentation aspect of this is writing down who is in charge of talking to whom at what groups and documenting those specific procedures. So here's an example of something that would be, you know, a list of your different publics, a list of your different stakeholders, contact information, and then names of people, names of individuals. This person is in charge of contacting the daily newspapers with a personal visit, okay? Another great thing here that you might look at in terms of documentation is a crisis communication checklist. And then again, documenting who's done it, what was the date, the time, comments, things like that, okay? And then this last section is this idea of pre-gathered information, information that you've gathered beforehand about the potential crises that your organization is going to face. So these could be things like information sheets, background on E. coli and what happens and who it affects and those types of things. Could be backgrounders of information about who your company leadership is. Fact sheets about, you know, we have the highest safety record in the state or the nation, things like that. And then key messages that are specific to what does your organization need and want to communicate during a crisis that is related to this topic. Another kind of thing that you can do is create templates with this pre-gathered information. If you know that a particular bacterial or pathogenic outbreak is potentially a problem for you and your organization, you can create templates for news releases, contact information here, and then you want to make sure that you arrange these according to the crisis and the priority sort of that your inventory indicates, and then make sure that they're easy to access. And so in the binder or whatever you create, make sure that there are tabs that show you where this information is. You also want to make sure that you make a note or you include information that is proprietary. You make a notification about that. And then a lot of times, great crisis communication plans have this idea of a glossary or some sort of warning about, here's the technical jargon we use when communicating with media sources, you might need to use these alternative terms. And so then the last piece of information that you document and put in this crisis communication plan is information about the Crisis Control Center. And this is where everybody on the crisis management team is going to go during a crisis and operate from. So it's that sort of management center. Information about where that is, when it's available, when it's open, how to get there, those types of things. Okay, so in sort of getting ready to conclude and pass back to Dr. Ploszka, I want to remind you, or I want to emphasize that in planning for crisis, you see a lot of pieces in crisis communication that working with these different functional roles within your organization, people from these different areas, you can do a lot of work beforehand and gather important information that can help you in a crisis situation. And the process of planning and doing this and laying all of this out actually serves to help your organization be better, even before a crisis happens, at addressing issues within your organization. So when we talk about crisis communication plan and planning, you need to make sure that you're focused on the verb, the idea that planning, you are continuing to do it. It is an ongoing process. It evolves, and not focusing on the noun of here we have a plan. Here it is. It's never going to change. We have that and it's done. Okay. The process, going through this process helps you identify stakeholders, which we know is critical. And then it helps you identify processes and procedures that are associated with these things that could be potential crises in the future. And it helps you make sure that you revisit these. So this whole thing is much more of an organizational process than it really even is as a communication process. And so what it creates here, the idea is that it creates a quote unquote living document that can be used. It's not a guidebook. It's not, excuse me, it is a guidebook. It is not a roadmap or a set of step-by-step instructions. Turn here, go there, those types of things. It's a guidebook. It's a structure. It's a document to help you remember the process that you went through in preparing and to give you easy, quick access to information that you already know and are familiar with. So very important to understand the difference between the plan itself and planning. And the hope here is that in working on stakeholder relationships, creating a management team for your crisis and a crisis communication plan, you can have this newspaper headline, crisis averted. Typically what happens is that there is no headline because there isn't a crisis and nothing to cover in the media. But be thinking about how you can use these principles as action steps to help organizations that you're involved with. And with that, I am going to turn things over here. Actually, we have, let's see, is it break time or is it? No, it's you. We're just transferring over to Dr. Poloshka. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share and make that process happen.